It is the newest and arguably the most regal looking of the Saber Tiger series, iconic to Medarot since the days of Medarot 2. It is STG04 Seivatalis, with the kits of Head Trap, Hypercharge Blade, Clock Rage, Biped Legs, and the leg ability of Soaring, which buffs all leg stats, minus armor and heavy limit, for every melee skill that is used, stacking 5 times. Now, as the latest installment in the Saber Tiger series, Seivatalis decides to take another rather interesting approach on the design, and instead of looking like a true Saber Tiger or a barbaric humanoid type of design, or even a soldier-based design based on Machairodis or Scimitar Tooth prior to him, Seivatalis, on the other hand, takes a more knightly and regal-looking approach, which I really do like, being completely honest, and helps him stand apart from his previous brethren and fellow cousins of the Saber Tiger motif. Head Trap on the head part is a setup-based skill that sets a passive-aggressive trap on the enemy side of the field. While this trap is in effect, any enemies that use their head skills, no matter what it is, will be punished with bonus damage as passive aggression and a way to essentially deter them from using that head skill, especially if it's an enemy AI, because if the head goes down, of course, the bot shuts down and it's all over. Hypercharge Blade on the right hand is a conventional Metaforce-powered melee skill that gets a damage bonus relative to the amount of charge in your gauge, but also consumes a pretty hefty amount of charge at the same time. For Hypercharge Blade, when fully capped, it only takes 15% of the charge, but also deals triple the amount of charge percentage relative. If you're not capped at 5-star, it'll instead take 30% of your Metaforce gauge. So very, very expensive to use, but with a base damage of almost 1700, looking at that number there, almost triple that or even triple whatever your Metaforce charges can most certainly add up, and especially if you pair it with a Hunter or Sniper nature medal to keep that Metaforce sustain going. Clock Rage on the left arm, and the first instance of Clock Rage on a non-collaboration model. The first model that introduced this being Tira Megatron from the Transformers collaboration a short few months ago, but simply explaining it's a very unique melee skill with a very strange modifier that deals bonus damage relative to 50% of the target's heat stat. So basically, Clock Rage is a very good way to punish people that specialize in high speed or high charging leading up to the line, as a way to essentially, again, punish them for having that high speed or even daring to outspeed Seivatalis, or anyone on his team rather, just for having that stat there. Now, the only real drawback to Clock Rage is the fact that it does not have pierce damage to it, so it basically falls in line with the same behaviors as Effect Clear, where it can be immensely painful as a punish-based skill, but it's going to be very handy for spot nuking more than anything else, in contrast to Hypercharge Blade, which is basically hack and slash as long as you have the charge in your gauge to use it. Both of these attacks as well pair very nicely with the leg ability of Soaring, as it does mean that his already very impressive leg stats will be going notably higher, making him faster, chunkier, and even more likely to dodge attacks for every skill that he lands the first 5 times. But on the topic of his leg stats, he is packing some very impressive numbers, like I said before. With a base mobility of 888, almost 900, he is most certainly packing a very promising base speed at the start of the battle before it even begins or any modifiers are added. So speed, much like his predecessors, Smilodon, X-Size, Machairodis, Scimitar Tooth, or anyone else they decide to add, he is most certainly not going to be lacking in the speed department. And also holding true to the STG series, he also does excel very well in dodging and grazing attacks. With an evade of just shy of 1850, he's most certainly going to have a very easy time dodging or grazing attacks, since his evade stat is pretty close to even that of flight legs in many cases, which essentially specialize at evade. Sea legs as well, as a way to keep his damage to a minimum. Melee resist of just shy of 1200 is really good too, as it means he can hold his own up close and personal, and a shoot resist of 732 It's not terrible, but he most certainly will be taking a pretty notably higher amount of damage from incoming shooters. Now, this isn't to say that the shooter is going to be absolutely taking him out, such as someone with very light armor, but it is going to be noticeably higher, so exercise just a little bit of caution if you are going to be using Seivatalis on the team. In terms of other numbers, though, much akin to a Knight of Valor, he is packing some pretty promising armor as well, with a head HP of about 4,000, right arm about 3,500, left arm at 3,400, and legs at 3,750. He is relatively chunky in the armor department, so even if he does take an incoming blow from a shooter, he can definitely hold it pretty well without it crippling him too quickly. All this being said, though, as a pure set score, I still do have to rate Seivatalis a pretty solid and well-rounded 7.5 out of 10. In contrast to previous STG-type models that specialize in collateral and spread damage between a claw and a hammer attack of varying means, minus, of course, Machiritis and Scimitar Tooth. Seivatalis kind of takes after the later developments, again, such as Machiritis and Scimitar Tooth, focusing on more conventional melee combat, much akin to a Stag Beetle Kuwagata type, with a conventional sword-based skill and another conventional skill as a hammer in this case. But Seivatalis instead deviates from that with a Metaforce Charge Blade and a punish skill instead of an AoE. Plus, the leg ability of Soaring again does synergize very nicely with his kit as a whole, as it means for every time he uses either Clock Rage or Hypercharge Blade, he will be getting progressively faster, more dodgy, and just a little bit better on the overall damage reduction the longer he's allowed to stay on the field. As mixed parts, I do have to rate him equally as well at a well-rounded 7.5 out of 10, given that all of his parts are pretty well-rounded across the board, and there really is no real drawback to using any of them. Thanks to the overhaul that was announced at time of recording that traps and setup skills in general will be getting, and becoming much more aggressive on that, passive aggression may or may not be coming back as an overall meta, especially as a help to super invasions or modifiers where shooting and melee combat is not allowed. Hypercharge Blade as well, it honestly goes without saying it's a very solid skill to use, especially if you need something that's relatively reliable but doesn't leave you wide open. Clock Rage will probably be the only skill you may or may not use often, if at all. It can be a very nasty skill to use, especially against healers that specialize in very high heat and cool stats, but against everyone else or very heavy nukers which aren't necessarily as fast, he may or may not find a lot of use with using Clock Rage in favor of Hypercharge Blade. And leg ability of Soaring on biped legs, really don't have to say much about that. He has very good terrain coverage as a biped type, and leg ability of Soaring does synergize very nicely, not just with his kit, but also with basically any kind of melee skill that you choose to equip him with.